Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Doomtree, titled All Hands. So let me pose to you all a question. How easy should art be to consume? Because as a critic who covers so many genres of music, especially pop, it gets to be an interesting conversation when you ask this question. I mean, on the one hand, you'll find plenty of critics, scholars, and people just looking to challenge themselves who seek out all sorts of challenging or draining art that can really push the mind and the body. On the other hand, you go into the mainstream, you find all sorts of art that's not designed to challenge at all, whether by catering or pandering to its audience, or by tapping into very specific pleasure centers that are easy to recognize. It goes down pretty easy. Now let's pose the hard question. What's better? Well, that's a loaded question, especially when you bring in artistic intent. On the one hand, art that is experimental or thought-provoking is often hailed for pushing those boundaries, disparaging more commercial products, even if eventually it doesn't turn out to be all that deep. And yet, as I've said in the past, there's craftsmanship in some degree of populism. I mean, sure, there might be a formula to commercially accessible art and getting it down, but creating something truly special and unique in this vein, or wrapping challenging subject matter into an easy-to-swallow package, that's a lot more difficult. But let's ask a very different question. What makes art, in this case music, difficult to consume? Well, you get your power electronics or certain subgenres of metal that are actively abrasive, but then you get bands like Swans, who put together 2.5-hour albums with 34-minute songs. Sure, it's a tough sound to eventually get used to, but what's really daunting about an album like To Be Kind is the length and how long it goes on to really understand and take in. But then you get an act like Minnesota hip-hop collective Doomtree, a group that's not daunting because of the length of their albums, but because of sheer density. 5 rappers known for aggressively cerebral lyrics that recall beat poetry, interwoven with hard-edged social commentary set against production that's explosive and rough. Doomtree records can be exhausting to really take in and fully comprehend and understand. And unsurprisingly, this album has been one of my most anticipated of 2015. Now, I originally got into Doomtree through one of their members, Dessa, who I'd easily put down as one of my favorite female MCs ever, period, and the group won me over really fast. I wouldn't say they've made a perfect record yet. Some of the more experimental production choices haven't always worked, and the politically minded lyrics can occasionally venture into conspiracy theory nonsense, which I've got no patience for. But both their self-titled debut album and No Kings had some fantastic cuts on them that are rewarding both on an intellectual and very visceral level. So you can bet that I was absolutely psyched for their newest album, All Hands. Did we finally manage to get that classic? Well, it's definitely a change of pace, that's for damn sure. As expected, Doomtree has made a difficult album with this release, and while some of the reasons remain the same from previous albums, production that aggressively pushes against what's conventional, MCs with layered and complicated bars that assume the listener can keep up, but where this album changes most is in its focus, tone, and overall atmosphere. It's a much colder and bleaker album, even more impenetrable than their last record, and while I don't quite think it's the all-star classic that I'm convinced Doomtree eventually could make, it's definitely the sort of record that'll sound like nothing else you will hear this year. And yeah, I absolutely think it's amazing. One of the best records that will be released this year, bar none. So okay, let's start with the most palpable changes, and those will be in the instrumentation and the production. Now, Doomtree have always been forward-thinking and challenging when it comes to production, and the sound that Laserbeak, Thistle Otter, P.O.S, and Paper Tiger chose for this record is decidedly a change in focus. The synths are blocky, glitchy, and blaring. The massive effects, they wobble and grind together, the percussion crashes, and the beats feel all the more fragmented. And all of it is stuffed into a mix that balances moments of pure emptiness with textures that feel stripped away of some of the warmth that used to characterize Doomtree's sound. Even the guitar flutters on Heavy Rescue, they feel distant and far removed. While LP's production on Run the Jewels could have some chillier moments, this is the sort of cold that calls to mind the frigid, howling wasteland of the Midwest in the dead of winter. And it was only when I was trudging through the blizzard that was tearing through Toronto this morning that my memories of growing up back out in the Midwest in Winnipeg came back, and the production just really clicked for me. And I'm not always saying this production always works. The choice to go for such frigid synths and abrasive sounds, it's consistent across the record, but it can sometimes mean that some of the instrumentation can start to run together a bit, and that keeps you hunting for the details to really distinguish certain songs. And while the details are often there, I loved how the production seemed to evolve and change and switch up with different rappers within the same songs, giving them their own musical motifs. I love that how despite the density of their bars, Doomtree still knows how to write a killer chorus, like on Final Boss, Grey Duck, Heavy Rescue, and especially Beastface. and the subtle flourishes like the thick plucks of the bends that almost remind me of a Yakuza movie, there are moments where the production could have benefited from a little bit more restraint and control, a little bit more quiet moments to switch it up. Eventually, production this monolithic and heavy becomes almost monochrome, especially considering the almost single-mindedness of the album's tone. Now granted, this density is characteristic across all Doomtree records, and of course you get a lot in the lyrics too. And like the best of rap posses, every rapper has a unique writing style, and the ability to impressively switch up their flows show a lot of real talent on display here. Now for me, Dessa is always the highlight. Her bars have the sort of ruthless, authoritative tightness to their construction that I've always loved. And while she doesn't show off as much emotional range as she can on her solo projects, her delivery can easily match the real frigidity of the sound on this album. From there, Sissel Otter's carefully restrained tension, Mike Michian's more expressive and direct wordplay with surprising moments of brilliance, and Sims's offbeat and frequently funny lyricism, they add a lot of variety. And they all get winning bars, including the first Crystal Pepsi reference in music I think I've ever heard. Thank you, Sims, for that. That was a nice touch. Now, if there was an MC that I struggle with, it's P.O.S. His flow and his wordplay is arguably the most stripped down and raw on this record, going for punk aggression. And while his multisyllabic delivery definitely works on songs like Marathon and especially Mini Brute, which I'd argue are the highlights of their respective songs, and yet his punchlines strangely don't always connect with the same force as they should, especially for an album that feels as careening out of control and wild as this one does. Now this is where we actually need to talk about lyrical content. And the first thing that needs to be noted here is the majority of this album was written in a cabin, cut off from most of the rest of the world and isolated. And you can tell. Doomtree has always been a cult band, but this is the first record where their focus is turned more internal to actually talk about what that means for them. Now, like most art written about being artists, there's a certain Ouroboros element to it, but to their credit, there's more than just smug glorification of that indie cult status, instead pulling their listeners deeper into the rabbit hole of what it was really like. And if anything, it's an endurance trial, and I mean that as a compliment. A record that shows Doomtree dragging their listeners into the frozen backwoods down darkened roads with an unsteady recklessness that almost feels primal. And while you get the bars that show acrid contempt for mainstream artists and the culture that won't respect their brand of hip-hop and art, they also know this sort of material will resonate with a smaller audience. They're trying to rescue those people. And this album feels more like a trial for those fans to both keep up and to see who Doomtree really are, see if they're gonna be fans at the end. And here's where we get to the point where this album gets kind of complicated, because as much as they have great lines that they drop to fill up this album, you can make the argument that the songs are more abstractly sketched and fragmented than they've ever been. And of course that's intentional. Doomtree state multiple times on this record that they expect the audience to keep up, and they aren't going to be explaining it easily. But it also leaves you searching for that overarching theme and punchline, and the growing suspicion throughout much of this album that they don't really have one. Sure, you get the political moments. 38 Airway is noted with references to Bernie Getz, a man who infamously shot 4 black men on the subway in the 80s, and anyone can see the significance of those references coming out in 2014. Before, as violent as that song is, it reveals a lot of moments of self-doubt and futile attempts to kill one's gods and determine one's own destiny if they even can. Hell, Mike Michian's final bar, "I made a stick into the gun and stared right at the sun." Bang. And it's really all over this record, that feeling of futility against fighting against larger forces you can't control, and the desperation to cut down to the end and find something that really matters. And it's really Marathon that drives this bleakness home, the closer. The chorus is, "When it all boils down, there's nothing but bones left," reducing it down to the most primal, the most universal humanity to which only the barest of details of the original person can be reconstructed, and yet it's something we all share. And when you have nothing left to lose, when you're stripped down to those bones, the larger world can't stop you. So in other words, look, Doomtree's definitely not for anyone. And this record is more than most, is one of the most difficult to really unpack and decode and deconstruct. Even after a good dozen listens, I'm still pulling out new scraps of wordplay that interweave with each other, more running motifs and themes and lines that might seem like filler until you start digging deeper. And even with that, this album is not an easy listen. Bleak, ragged, not so much of an Ouroboros process, but the group finding their core by flaying away anything that's unnecessary. It's a real harrowing listen to be sure, and yet the more I delve deeper, the more the sound just clicks on a primal level for me that the record's only managed in pieces. That's exceptional. For me, this record manages to snag a 9 out of 10 and the highest of recommendations. I had really high hopes for this album going in, and while I definitely was not expecting this, it managed to surprise and connect with me in a way that only a band like Doomtree really could. And if you need help for this really sinking in for you, go take a long walk in the snow, out in the woods, out in the wilds. Trust me, it'll come to you then. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd be like and subscribe and be more than grateful. I'm amid a hot streak of great albums coming out recently. Let's hope that streak continues coming up next. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.